What is going on, men? Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about some really cool loads for the 30-06. The old warhorse that just refuses to go to the glue factory. Time marches on. World wars stack. Empires rise and fall. Entire nation states have disappeared in the lineage of this cartridge. Taylor Swift has gone from country music to whatever it is she sings now. Still, the 30-06 abides. And there have been many really cool loads developed for it. That's what we're going to talk about today. So if that interests you, stay tuned to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Quick, rapid-fire bio. While you're listening or fast-forwarding, if you could, like, subscribe, leave a review, hit some stars, consider checking out Patreon. Blessed to have served in the military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. Alright, the 30-06, the storied 30-06, the legendary, you might even say, 30-06, has been around since 1906. You might say even earlier than that if you wanted to go back to the 30-03, but let's say 30-06, that's a long history. So I must put some parameters on this list, like a common load that you could get or make today with common components that you would reasonably go out and shoot. Not like the black tip armor-piercing rounds. Those are cool. You could probably still get them. You're probably not just going to the range and shooting. You're probably not going to the range and making it rain with black tip armor-piercing ammo. Likewise, we're not talking about the 30-06 Sabo rounds. Those were factory available. You could probably find a box somewhere on Gunbroker or something and obtain them, but you're probably not going out varmint hunting with them. Is it cool that you can launch out of a 30-06 a 55 grain bullet at 4,080 feet per second? You know, a velocity that would make a 223 blush and feel inadequate? That is really cool. But again, you're probably not going out and shooting a bunch of prairie dogs with those. I'm talking about commonly available, attainable loads. Really cool loads for the 30-06. And that is one of the really cool things about the 30-06 is you can go from really fairly lightweight for caliber, screaming high velocity rounds, all the way up to big heavy bruisers. Give credit where credit is due. I'm going to look some loads up that are on Midway USA. They're not a sponsor of the show. They don't give me any money. They probably have no idea that I'm talking about them. However, I find their website really good and easy to use. And I've shopped with them so long that my password is my old L.A.P.D badge number, if that gives you some idea. But again, they're not a sponsor of the show. They're a pretty good website to use to look for ammo that's around. And they let you do things like search by grain weight, which we're going to use on this episode. Now, one of the coolest loads that got me thinking about doing this entire episode is the Hornady Custom Light. This is a factory load. What we're going to talk about in this portion of the episode is a factory load. Hornady Custom Light, 125 grain SST. What's cool about this is it's a factory light load. If you want a light load, you want, enough to kill any deer on the planet, but you don't want more than that for a young shooter, for a female shooter, heck, just for you. You've got a 30-06 that you want to pass down to a grandkid, and you don't want to get them started with a flinch and a massive recoiling load. This is a 125 grain bullet at 2,700 feet a second. That's both lighter in grain weight and slower in velocity than many common loads. And it's really, really cool that you can get that in a factory loaded option. And a let's call it a welterweight, 7 to 9 pound 30-06 rifle, just from my experience in shooting and being around a lot of different rifles, that would not be an unpleasant rifle to shoot, assuming it fit you and you didn't get scope bite or anything like that. So if you got a kid that really likes history of guns and stuff like that, and they love 30-06, but you don't want to get them started with, 180 grain heavy hitting load, and this is plenty for any deer on the planet. 125 grain at 2,700 feet a second. If you can't take a deer with that, that's probably a you problem, probably not a ballistics problem. Now, if you want to stay in that 125 grain range, which I think that's a really sweet range, this kind of 125, 130 weight range is a really, really good one for deer and deer size game, which is what a lot of people use the 30-06 for. I know that 150 to 168 is the standard, but I think for a lot of people it makes a lot of sense to move down to the 125s. I would say a good normal load for this, Nosler loads a 125 grain hunting load at 3,100 feet a second. That's nothing to sneeze at. So if you were looking for a factory option, and you were like, I'm going to shoot deer occasionally, but mostly I'm going to shoot coyotes with a 30-06, man, this is a good option for that. 3,100 feet a second, you're getting into a high velocity 22 round territory, but instead of launching a 55 grain to 62 grain projectile, you're launching a 125 grain projectile. To put that in perspective, at 3,100 feet a second. Talking about coyotes, I should also mention that will be a good load, not the only one, but that will be a really good load also for hogs. Now this load, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the reasons I love the 30-06. One of the reasons I got a 30-06 was for this load, this factory load. Ye Olde Remington Corelock, but not the more common 150 grain or 180 grain. I'm talking about the Bruiser, the Remington Corelock 220 grain jacketed soft point. This load has been knocking down big critters for a long, long time, for decades and decades. A 220 grain projectile at 2410 feet per second. If big, heavy bullets at decent, respectable, moderate velocities is your thing, this is your factory load for the 30-06. A 220 grain round nose Remington Corelock at 2410. There is nothing breathing in North America that will not kill. And I should mention, because it's a big projectile at moderate velocities, even in my Winchester Pre-64 featherweight, it's one of the more mild recoiling loads because it's not a sharp snap into the shoulder. It's not like a hard slap in the face. It's more like a gentle push with the same amount of force. It's a good load. And again, one of the reasons I have the 30-06 is for this very load. It is a beautiful, beautiful load. And again, that's a Remington Corelock 30-06, 220 grains at 2410 feet per second. And I like 35 Whelen, don't get me wrong. And if you are just going to hunt elk and timber, and if you are just going to hunt, large-bodied bear, and that's it, 35 Whelen has a lot of merit. If you're only hunting moose out of a canoe, right? 35 Whelen is it's a good cartridge, and I wish it was more popular. But here's the thing, it's more of a one-trick pony than the old Warhorse, the 30-06. It doesn't have near the flexibility. This is sticking with the same manufacturer. This is a Remington load, high performance Remington, no less. 250 grain at 2400. This is the 35 Whelen. 250 grain at 2400. That's slightly less velocity than the 30-06 with a slightly heavier bullet. Now you may decide if you're only hunting big bears over bait or something, that's a good cartridge. But you're not dropping down to that 125 grain screaming hot load either. So just to put that in perspective, that 30-06 with that 220 grain load, and that's a factory load. It's not even loading it hot. Because you got to remember, the 30-06 came out in 1906. The pressures that Sammy allows you to load that cartridge to so you don't blow up an old Springfield is less than a lot of modern cartridges. So even with those, let's say, fairly pedestrian pressures, you're still with the 30-06 nipping on the heels of the 35 Whelen. And you can get mad at that if you want, but look at the numbers. Argue with math. Now, going back to that weight range that I think is really good, solid copper monolithic plays by its own rules. You have to throw out what you think about what grain weight you should have for what animal. Copper plays by its own rules. It's in a league of its own. Much like feminist baseball players, right? It's in its league of its own. The 130 grain solid coppers was a load that I used to be really enthusiastic about long ago, before everybody was talking about solid coppers. Well, Barnes lists a 130 grain reduced recoil load, 130 grain at 2760 feet per second. If you want to go that lower recoil route and you want solid copper, that's a really good factory option. And that's far less, I know from hand loading in the past, that's far less than the screaming velocity you can push 130s to. And there's no deer, and I know technically a moose is a deer, but give me a break. I'm talking about like deer when you think of deer. There's no deer in North America, from the biggest whitetail of Maine to the biggest bodied muley of the Sonoran Desert. There's no deer that I would not hesitate to take with 130 grain Barnes and a 30-06. And even with this reduced power load, it'll do it. Well, what about if you don't want to go all the way up to the big bruiser of the 220 grain, but you still want to be on a heavyweight scale? Well, N.R.A has a factory load for a 200 grain bullet at 2540 feet per second. I dare say there's no cervid on the planet that I wouldn't hunt with that. From moose to elk to anything else, if you are keeping it at moderate, reasonable ranges. That's a good load. N.R.A 200 grain at 2542. And talking about copper, I would put, it would be debatable, and it really is for me. I vacillate back and forth between the two when I'm in big bear country, and I live in, a state with grizzly bear, and I've lived in Alaska with brown bear. It really is a hard debate for me whether 180 grain copper is better than a 200 or 220 grain lead soft. And I've debated that with myself to the point where I think it's a pretty even draw. But if we look at federal loads, a 180 grain STX, this is a factory load. 180 grain at 2,700 feet a second. Copper has a reputation, especially that amount of copper screaming out of there, for really good, straight, deep lined deep penetration on challenging targets. Copper has that in spades. That's a good load. And there are several 180 grain solid copper loads. I just picked one out. There are several 180 grain solid copper loads for the Alt-6. And if you want to stick with the 180 grains, but you don't want to go with the copper because you think it's for hippies that hunt in Birkenstocks and you want to kill something with lead like a real man, just picking a load here, a good one. Nosler AccuBond. AccuBonds are known, perhaps not as much as one of the next loads I'm going to talk about, but AccuBonds are known for being good on challenging targets. There's a 180 grain factory load with AccuBonds at 2750 feet a second for over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy. And that's a SIG load. Even SIG is loading for the old 30-06. And perhaps one of the most legendary projectiles, maybe not as legendary as the 30-06 itself, but pretty close, is the Nosler Partition. And much like the 30-06, with many of these new cartridges coming online, claiming to be hotter, faster, if you have one, men will want to be you and women will want you, and it'll cure male pattern baldness and make you 6 inches taller, and all these claims they try to make to dethrone the 30-06, but the 30-06 keeps hanging on. Many newer, fancier bullets try to dethrone the Nosler Partition, but the Nosler Partition also marches on. And there are factory loadings just on this one website for the 30-06 with nozzler partitions and factory loads and 150 grain, 180 grain, and 165 grain. Not just one, but 3 different grain weights and several different loads of the nozzler partition in the 30-06. Pick your flavor. Alright, with that, let's transition to Ogden Powder Company and their reloading data center to maybe illustrate some of the potential you can unlock if you get into hand loading with the flexible, venerable Alt-6. Now, the lightest we could find factory load for the 30-06 was 125 grain, but if you hand load, you can go down to the 110 grain. And these are published loads. These are not even like pushing the envelope. There are several loads with several different powders that will give you 110 grain at 3,500 feet per second. And that's light for the 30-06, but that's still way, way heavier than, let's say, the Speed, let's say Queen, the 22-250. The King would probably be the 220 Swift. But you're not talking about a 40 grain, right? You're not talking about even a 50 or 55 grain. You're talking about double that, literally double the 55 grain. And a lot of your 22-250s are going to be down in the 40 grains, 45 grains. You're talking about a 110 grain projectile screaming at 3,500 feet per second. Now, I told you how fond I used to be of the 130 grain solid coppers. Now, I used to load those for hunting with the 308. With that 130 grain solid copper. So again, this plays by different rules. It's going to do, in my opinion, a lot more than a 130 grain cup and core. And I like cup and core bullets. But you can push this solid copper, which is probably going to hold its integrity pretty well. You can push 130 grain out of this 30-06 with a published load at over 3,000 feet per second. And here's the thing. That's a starting load. There are starting loads at over 3,000 feet per second. We're not even going up into high-end loads, published loads. Where this is bottom of the barrel, like low-end, minimum pressure loads. You can get well up into the 3,200s if you even want that much velocity with 130 grain solid copper or hand loading with a 30-06. That, I think, is a lot of untapped potential that you can get if you hand load. And you can get a little bit heavier. If 220 is not enough for you, there's a listing for a 225 grain. And within published data and published loads, you can go up to over 2,400 feet per second. Published load, not going crazy. 225 grain at 2,400 feet per second. And you're not getting up into Magnum territory. You're not talking about like the 300 Win Mag with very inefficient case and powder capacity. There's nothing wrong with that cartridge, but it's very inefficient compared to the 30-06. And these are just some of the things, right? Not even talking about the other benefits of hand loading where you neck size only, so you pretty much have a custom fit load to your gun, or the ability to adjust seating depth to fit the headspace in your gun, right? I'm just talking about different loads. You can unlock some untapped potential in the 30-06 if you hand load. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is the 30-06 so versatile with so many different loads because it's been around for well over 100 years and is popular still? Or is it popular still because it is so versatile and it handles such a wide variety of bullet weights and loads well? I say the answer is yes. With that, men, what do you think about this episode? It's a little bit different than what I normally do. I've done a whole cartridge talks, and I've done one on the 30-06 talking about its history and things like that. But what about just cool loads for a certain caliber? Do you dig it? Do you want me to talk about other stuff? What are your thoughts on that? With that, guys, your tactical tip of the day. You guys know if you listen for any length of time, I don't take sponsors on this show, but we talked about reloading. Here's a little tip. Unless you have a really, really good reason otherwise, if your cartridge, if your bullet load grain weight will take Varget, probably use Varget. Varget is a phenomenal powder for a wide variety of rifle calibers, loads, and it's a smart powder, meaning it's not temperature sensitive, meaning you could hunt, the Arctic Circle with it, you could hunt the equatorial region of Africa, and it'll be okay. Varget is a phenomenal powder. And again, I'm not sponsored by Varget. It's just a really good powder. So if you're looking and trying to decide between powders, if it is an option for the load you're looking at, Varget's a good one. All right, your tactical verse of the day. Pretty succinct, beautiful. Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong. Let all that you do be done with love. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.